It's good to be here and to have the kind invitation from Marvin and from Jack also to share in this special time of remembering some things about how CR got started. I haven't seen most of you probably since a couple of years ago when the church was celebrating then as well, the 100th, the centennial. And unfortunately, Martha was not able to be here then, and such is the case today, though she wants to be very much to be returning. We've missed you not only in being able to, return to worship, but to be involved in some kind of service because retirement hasn't been exactly as we had hoped it would be for us. But we're still kicking. Though Martha would dispute that, I think, right now. But since her fall in April, the progress has been slow but steady. She is a resilient person and very determined, and we're not going to give up. We're blessed to have home health services, as maybe some of you have known through your rehab experiences. We have a real dedicated and loyal caregiver who is helping both of us during the week, and two beautiful and encouraging daughters who give support. We're anchored also in the love that we know from our church family. And we thank you for every remembrance of prayer and the notes of encouragement and cards that you have sent our way. One of the significant ways we miss being here is the congregational singing, and being reminded of that this morning. Our duets at home are nothing compared to to what is happening here in the collective voice that you bring in the leadership of Brent and Susan and other talented musicians and gifted folks who help bring worship to each of us. Walter Brueggemann has shared that we sing because life is God-given, life is God-sustained, and life is God-claimed. Singing is our glad response to all the God-givenness of our lives. How can we keep from singing? Thank you for your faithful witness through worship to this community and beyond. A part of my being here today, as Marvin said, is to speak about Celebrate Recovery. But I think undergirding all of that is a presence of trying to bear witness to God's love and healing in my own life. The ministries of recovery, the medical clinic, Covenant Counseling Center are just beautiful examples in every way of God's love poured out to the neighbor. I believe that there are scriptures that support this in so many ways. I've chosen two passages this morning to read sort of as a backdrop to some things I want to say. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, but when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they came together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind, or with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and prophets. And then in 1 John chapter 4, verses 19 through 21, we love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God shall love his brother and his sister also. It hardly seems possible, as Marvin said, that this many years have passed. And 15 years, I guess, since Mitch Wisnett, who's here this morning, and he's the retired minister of education, for those of you who haven't had the privilege of meeting him or know his history here. The late Jerry Johnson, a devoted follower of Christ and chairman of deacons, or chair-elect at the time. The two of us, or the three of us, went to Orange County, California at Saddleback Church. Our mission was to receive training and bring back information and inspiration to support the beginnings of CR. As most of you know, this ministry shows love to people and their loved ones who are suffering from addictions, life hurts, hang-ups, excuse me, all of which are usually wrapped in layers of shame and guilt and fear. When I retired in December of 2014, Mitch became the CR director, and after his retirement, Jack Carpenter was called to that place of leadership. And I'm grateful for the help of both of these men and countless others who've given so much time and energy to this ministry. Pivotal to those early days were folks like Paul Aspie, who could put a spreadsheet together like no other person. Fran Ledford, who has gone on before us, who had one of the biggest hearts for hurting people. There have been lots of volunteers who have been and still are the face of Christ to brothers and sisters in need of compassion and understanding and support. As a person who grew up with an alcoholic father until I was 16 years old, recovery was in short supply for our family. Even if we'd known how to access it, it was the secret that no one talked about. My father was a functioning alcoholic, very stable person in terms of his work ethic. But we just suffered through. My maternal grandfather and two of my mother's brothers were also suffering from or suffered from alcohol abuse. There are still too few places of help, and people still live secret lives of despair. Addiction and pain are not respecters of persons, and we've said at CR on many occasions that all God's children got stuff. I'm grateful to belong to a church that seeks to be a beacon of light to shine in the dark corners of suffering people. The CR ministry received help in our evolving years from other church programs like Cokesbury United Methodist Church in Knoxville and Biltmore Baptist Church in Asheville. And we, in turn, through our CR ministry, became a catalyst for other people, other churches to begin groups and to train their volunteers. Earlier, when I read these scriptures, I was saying that I think they give a framework for all of the important ministries when we are reaching out to other people and showing love to the neighbor. There's nothing really outstanding in this passage from the Gospels. It's just another occasion, it seems, where the Pharisees are trying to raise a question with Jesus, as they so often did. Teacher, one of them asked, which commandment in the law is greatest? And the Jews, of course, were people of laws. And this Pharisee wanted to know what Jesus thought of the law that was at the top of the list. Instead of one law, however, Jesus reaches back into the Old Testament to two books, one from a passage from Deuteronomy that we know as the Shema, and then from Leviticus. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second is like it, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus pulled these commandments together in a way that surprised his audience, especially the Pharisees. Love God, love neighbor, love self. This is not a multiple choice test. The answer is all of the above. Love God. Few of us would argue with that part of the commandment, would we not? St. Augustine wrote centuries ago that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee, O God. And then Evelyn Underhill no doubt took inspiration from Psalm 121 when she wrote, we lift our eyes from the crowded bypass to the eternal hills. In Psalm 121, I lift up my eyes to the hills from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord who made heaven and earth. You and I, as people of faith gathered here today, are called to live with an upward glance, to lift our eyes from the crowded ways of life to the transcendent. As pastors, we assume that inside each human spirit there is a divine hunger for something holy, for something mysterious, for something different than what people have found in the journey of life just on their own. We talk about finding God, and that's often heard in a crisis or from those who have come for support in CR. But more accurately, we talk about God finding us. You see, to love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, all of ourselves assumes that God first loves us with all of God's self. We love, the scripture says, because he first loved us. The biblical narrative moves quickly from creation to that loving pursuit of God across the whole pages of humanity. And at some grace-filled point, we respond and we begin the relationship of loving God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind. It may be as children who come and they are hearing and they are responding, as teenagers or as a young adult or as an older adult. That God first loving us becomes a bedrock of our faith. To trust a God who loves us no matter what. To love God. To love your neighbor. This seems to be the right thing to do for those hearing Jesus' words. But the Pharisees, like many of us, are on a different page. When it comes to the definition of neighbor, neighbors are not just folks who look like us or talk like us or think like us. Neighbors to Jesus were also people like Samaritans and lepers, women, children. Love your neighbor as yourself sounds a lot like the golden rule, doesn't it? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But Jesus had a big view of the neighborhood when he said, love your neighbor as yourself. There is a deep sadness and grief in the hearts of many of us on each occasion of violence by groups that spew hate toward those who don't think or look the same way. The world is witnessing a dangerous rise in rigid religions that seem to celebrate violence against others. There is an ideology at work among us that wants to make the world very small in order to make the world safe and to exclude and eliminate everyone who is not like us. Unfortunately, much of the rhetoric is in the name of religious piety. Such a practice of hurt and hatred is a contradiction to the Father of all mercies, who loves all the children and whose arms reach out to all the weak ones, no matter what color or religion. Jesus went to great lengths to identify sister and brother as everyone, including those most unlike us, those who do not fit in, those who upset us and make us uncomfortable. The Old Commandment has been revisited, and Jesus puts extra emphasis to include all as the neighbor. Those who heard Jesus kept restricting the neighborhood, while Jesus kept expanding it to include the marginalized of his day. These people Jesus talks about were to be loved, not loathed. So who is our neighbor? A person of another race or ethnicity, another religion or no religion, someone of another sexual identity, or the person who is poor, homeless, or a person who is addicted or abused. Sometimes the neighbors hardest to love may be ones we know the best. Someone has said that children are good observers, but poor interpreters. Growing up in a home where there's alcoholism or drug addiction or physical or sexual abuse creates pain so deep it takes a lifetime of recovery. Frederick Buechner tells the story of his father's suicide. It was on a Saturday morning, and Buechner and his brother were still in bed. They heard a noise and got up and looked out the window to see their father lying in the driveway. They were just children, and their father was dead by his own hand. For years, Buechner said, I couldn't bring myself to tell people how my father died. I would just say he had heart trouble. And then in that poignant moment of his, Buechner said, in a way, I was right. My father did die of a troubled heart. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. The neighborhood widens and narrows depending on our story. In recovery, the secrets of childhood and family abound, and the challenge of loving the neighbor closest to us still persists. Love for self. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. This little phrase is often neglected and overlooked. Many of us as children grew up with well-meaning parents and grandparents and Sunday school teachers who, were trying to teach us the secret of Christian joy. J-O-Y. It was Jesus first and others second and self last. It still sounds spiritual to our ears, and there's still some truth as we try to grow in maturity and understanding. But what lingers with kids, now grown-ups, is to put yourself last, with the notion that something is wrong with loving ourselves or protecting ourselves or having clear boundaries so that we can be safe. What Jesus was saying is that God made us. Whatever we are, we belong to God. Can we believe that we are loved unconditionally by God? Can we love ourselves for who we are as children of God, human becomings? We're still in process. People who are still growing and coming to grips with our lives, warts and all. God created us, and God sustains us through our human connectedness. God is a God of relationships. The plan of the Pharisees was to test Jesus, but Jesus is the one who gives the test. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. An expression heard at CR meetings is, you can't love out of an empty bucket, meaning it's got to come from inside. There's got to be self-love in order to be able to share that. If you're operating out of emptiness on the inside, it's very difficult to be real in those relationships. Some of you know the actress Viola Davis, And you know her character, Abilene, in the movie The Help, and how she has the responsibility to care for that little girl, baby girl, and how she gently takes that child's face in her hands, and she said, "You remember what I taught you, don't you? You is smart, you is kind, and you is important." The blessing. In life, we wait each day to be called by name, to be cared for, to have someone expect something of us and give something to us, like love and trust and respect. Life is a gift given daily, and we are amazed and grateful to be called yet again into personhood and as people of value. Galwell Kinnell says that each day is a day of reteaching loveliness. It is a day to call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on earth, a day to know the loving kindness of the Creator of the heaven and the earth. Kinnell says that sometimes it is necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness, to help people remember that their own loveliness and the loveliness of others are all made in the image of God. I think one of the large acts of reteaching loveliness manifests itself in the church through the gift of hospitality to the neighbor. It is the readiness to welcome those who are alone and hurting, abandoned and in need, and have been labeled and judged as outcasts in our society. It is hospitality that asks not if the person is qualified, but do they belong in the sphere of God's love and grace. The gospel truth is that we cannot love God whom we have not seen unless we love our brothers and sisters who are right in front of us. Jesus Christ has broken down the walls of separation. In him, all sorts of people recover their sanity and their humanity, their loveliness enough to see brother and sister. The daily challenge to practice our faith as followers of Christ allows us to see out beyond the world of exclusion of the other. What is offered is a world of welcome that sees the other not as a threat, not as a competitor, but as a cohort on the pilgrimage of humanity. This old commandment revisited says, because you are in this world, you belong. This assurance of belonging is not found in some social theory, but in the strange, mysterious truth that God, who loved the world so much that he gave his Son to show us love without measure. Jesus has broken down the walls which divide, walls that produce fear and arrogance and hunger and death. We belong to each other because divine compassion has been shown to us. And may that compassion be reborn and rekindled in our heart and mind today. And may that same compassion remain the compelling truth for this congregation that guides us to believe and practice the new commandment on into the future until God's kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven. Some of you know the writings of Henry Nouwen. He's a wise teacher in the art of listening to God's calling and framing of our lives with the values of God. In his book, Spiritual Direction, he shares this. He says that from the beginning of his life, he says, there have been two interior voices. They have been speaking to me. One saying, Henry, be sure you make it on your own. Be sure you become an independent person. Be sure I can be proud of you. And another voice saying, Henry, whatever you're going to do, even if you don't do anything very interesting in the eyes of the world, be sure you stay close to the heart of Jesus. Be sure you stay close to the love of God. Elsewhere, he reminds us in that book that we are here for just a short time, 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, 80 years. We're here for whatever time to discover and believe that we are a beloved child of God. Life is just a short opportunity for us during the few years we have to say to God, I love you too. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Amen.